Well, children ask all sorts of questions, don't they? Like even from very early on, grown children, but especially young children, constantly asking questions. Almost from birth, right? The first words that come out of their mouth, maybe it's mama, maybe it's dada, followed quickly on the heels by a one-word question asked incessantly 50 times a day, pretty much for the rest of their life, right? You're familiar with this question? Why, right? It's easy. We all know it because we all still ask it. Everybody in the room is somebody's child, and we've all asked it over and over and over. You can't get them to stop asking it. There are other questions you can't get children to stop asking, like those awkward ones in public that you're just not sure this is the right time or place. Like my son, when he was young, he was in the grocery cart, able to speak. He must have been 2.5. And we're just rolling around, and we see a man who was big in every way. He was big, and he was big, and he was big. And my son was pretty convinced, I think, that he was a superhero in disguise. But the way he processed this in his very low tone of voice, he's like, "Daddy, look at that big guy. Why is he so big? Why is that guy so big?" I'm just like, stop asking the question. The problem with the grocery store is that what do? You go back and forth through all the aisles. And so do the other people, every corner. "Dad, there's that big guy. Why is he so big?" It's like, dude, stop asking questions, please. There's the questions that you don't see coming, right? Questions that are unexpected. I never thought that when I walked my son into the movie theater, it would be in Las Vegas, and we would walk past slot machines, and my son would say, "Hey, can we play a video game?" We're like, no. And so we didn't see that coming. As a child, I go to my parents, and they did not see this coming. "Hey, Mom and Dad, I know that we've lived in Illinois for 30 plus years, and you've had 4 grandkids within an hour of your house. Hey, what do you think if we moved to Las Vegas?" They didn't see that coming, right? There are questions that you just don't see coming. There are questions that you do see coming and you wish they wouldn't come, like, "Hey, Mom and Dad, where do babies come from?" Awkward at lots of ages. And so, but there's one question that every single one of us, whether we have our own children, whether they're younger siblings, nieces, nephews, other people, there's one question that every single one of us will be asked at some point. Parents, your children will ask. Aunts, uncles, brothers, sisters, you will be asked. At some point, every single one of us runs into a question that I want to have an answer to. And more than that, I want to have an answer I'm excited to give. I don't want to have dread. I don't want it to be like, "Oh, I don't want to answer that question." I want to lean in. Before we get there, I want to set it up. Because the way I found this question, the way I came to this question is as we were getting ready for this whole series, these last 6 weeks on family and what God has in mind for our families, this question stopped me dead in my tracks in Deuteronomy chapter 6. But to really understand it, we kind of got to understand what's going on. So if you have your Bible or your device, grab that, go to Deuteronomy chapter 6. To catch you up in the story, we've done this before, but real quick, here it is. Moses was the guy, 80-year-old shepherd, who God shows up in a burning bush and says, "You, go to the most powerful person in the world and tell him to let my people go." Because God's people, 2 million of them probably, were in slavery in Egypt. Plagues, all that stuff, they come out, they cross the Red Sea, they go up the mountain, they get the law, they wander in the desert for 40 years because they are disobedient, and they come to the end of this after having been led by Moses for 40 plus years, and Moses says, "Look, you're going into a new season." Kind of like we hope all of our families are going into a new season. Moses says, "You're going into a new season. Let me help you get ready." And so what he says is there are a few things that he assumes. We're going to catch the first one in chapter 6, verse 10. In chapter 6, verse 10, he says, "The Lord your God will soon bring you into the land he swore to give you when he made a vow to your ancestors Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It is a land with large, prosperous cities that you did not build. Houses will be richly stocked with goods that you did not produce. You will draw water from cisterns that you did not dig, and you will eat from vineyards and olive trees that you did not plant." God says, "You know what? I told your granddad's 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 granddad, Abraham, that I was going to build a nation, and I did. And I told him that I was going to give them a land to live in. Even though for the past 400 years, all you've known is generations of slavery, I'm going to bring you into a land, and I'm going to enable you to conquer that land, and you're going to live in a way that you've never lived before." In the same way, if we'll follow in with what God has said about our families, he'll bring us into seasons in our family that we didn't think were possible. And you just need to know right out of the gate that the first assumption we can make is this: God will keep his promises. Notice that Moses said, when God brings you in, and God will bring you in. You see, the thing about God is he has never, ever failed to be who he said he is. He has never, ever failed to do exactly what he said he would do. The reason we can have faith is not because we're so good at believing. We can have faith because the one who we have our faith in is so faithful. He has never, ever failed. So the first assumption that is fair is God will keep his promise. And the same is true for our families. If we live into his way, he will bring us into places we didn't know were possible in our family. The second assumption comes out of verses 11 and 12. He says, when you have eaten your fill in this land. In other words, when you get there and you're living in these houses you didn't build and eating food that crops you didn't produce, he says in verse 12, be careful not to forget the Lord who rescued you from slavery in the land of Egypt. You must fear the Lord your God and serve him. He goes on and talks about other possible distractions. But what he's saying is, not only is it fair to assume that God will keep his promise, we can also assume that people will be tempted to forget. Isn't that how it goes? We have no problem paying attention to God when life's coming off the rails. It's when things start going well that we start to forget how we got there. We forget God's faithfulness and his provision that led us there. And that's what Moses is warning about. Finally, we get to this third assumption, and it's exciting and terrifying at the same time. This is the question that stopped me dead in my tracks, and I think it should stop us all. In chapter 6, verse 20, here's his assumption. In the future, your children will ask you. In the future, your children will ask you. And what Moses says is, what is the meaning of these laws, decrees, and regulations that the Lord our God has commanded us to obey? What Moses is saying is, there is going to be a generation who didn't see us cross the Red Sea, who didn't see God show up on the mountain and provide the 10 Commandments, who didn't see God provide manna and quail in the desert and carried us through, who might not have even seen the battles in the Promised Land. There's gonna come a day when you're living the way God has called you to live, and your children are gonna ask this question. And it's the question that all of us, I think, need to be prepared to answer. How did our family get this way? How did we end up where we are? There is no doubt that you are going to answer that question at some point. Might be at the next family wedding, family funeral, might be on a random Wednesday afternoon when your child comes in after a season of frustration and just says, how did it get this way? They'll ask it in 1,000 different ways, but you will get that question. And here's the question I want you to wrestle with today. What story do you want to tell? What story do you want to tell in that moment? Children will ask, how did our family get this way? The question is, what story do you want to tell? Now, you could lean into lots of things. And lots of people point at all the different circumstances and events that track through the story. Like, I could tell the story of our family like, well, you know, we grew up in a couple of really small towns in cornfields in Illinois. We got married young, don't do that. And we would go on and we'd get careers and do some teaching for a while. She'd do these things, and then this would happen, and she'd get depression, and then we'd have another kid, and these other things would happen, and then we'd move to Las Vegas. That's not really the story I want to tell. There's a lot in there that I didn't have control over. There's a lot of things there that I didn't choose. We could point at all the circumstance and things that happen, but the truth is we don't always decide our circumstance. We don't get full control over the events of our lives, but we can always determine our direction. How we walk through those, in pursuit of what that we walk through those things, we get to choose that. We can choose our direction. In fact, that's really what we're going to talk about for the rest of our day. When I get that question, how did our family get this way? I want to be able to say, well, all these things happened, but we were going this way. We'll get there in a minute. But first, I want to share a story of someone who was faced with some circumstance and got to choose direction and could have chosen one of two directions. Not a fan of the circumstance she was in, but definitely got to choose the direction. Check out this story.
My first experience with camp started at a sleepover. I remember waking up one morning to my friend's mom coming in the room, and she kind of shook us and said, "Get up, girls, we're going to church." And so there I was in the back row of church, hungover and in the clothes from the night before, when out walks my math teacher, Drew Moore, and my brother's football coach. And he instantly had my attention and started talking about a camp called CIY and inviting high schoolers to come along. And my friend said we should go, and at first I was not interested at all, but she said it would be a vacation. It would be a week away from home, and we'd meet cute guys, so I was in. I was all for it. So I decided to go to camp. There I am the morning of, sitting on the bus, waiting for my friend, and I didn't know a single person. I couldn't tell you where we were going. I couldn't tell you what church I was with, and a leader got on the microphone and said, "Hey guys, we're leaving in 5, and I just remember panicking because I didn't have my friend. And so I called her and she said, "Liz, I'm so sorry. I got sick in the middle of the night. I can't go to camp. My mom won't let me go." And I just remember thinking whether or not I was gonna stay on the bus. I was ready to get off the bus and leave because I was panicked. I didn't know what to do next. So right away on the bus, students and leaders recognized me as being new, and they introduced themselves, and they were really fun, really easy to get along with. I was instantly connected with friends. And then when we got to camp, I was connected to a group where we talked about life, and we talked about what we were learning throughout the week. And I quickly noticed that these people had something I didn't. Wasn't really sure what it was, and so I was in my dorm later that night, just laying in my bunk bed, and I put 2 and 2 together. I started to realize that the leader I was with all week and the students I'd become such good friends with really did have something I didn't have. They had a relationship with Jesus. And so I opened the Bible I was given earlier that week, and inside I wrote "Goal, Know Jesus, CIY 2006, and I just decided, you know what, like, I really believe this. Like, Jesus is the deal, and I want to live for him, and I want everyone to know that I'm really serious about this. And so I decided to get baptized, got dunked, and yeah, just started living my life for him. It was awesome. Who knew that the decision I made that day would radically change my life forever, and that 9 years later I'd be leading Canyon Ridge students who are going to CIY? It's coming up really fast, and I'm really excited, and I can't wait to meet the students who are on the fence like I was. It's really humbling to know that this all started with me saying yes to camp.
In case you couldn't tell, we're kind of a fan of camp around here. We believe that students giving their attention to God for a week or even a few days at a time just really matters. It's why this campus is going to explode this week with over 700 elementary students and maybe more who haven't signed up yet, and a bunch of volunteers who love them and lead them closer to Jesus. It's going to help them. It's going to fuel them. That's why we're doing a camp for incoming 6th graders to make that transition, that scary jump into middle school easier with some great friends and leaders, 7th and 8th grade camp. It's why there's a table out back for high school camp right now. We're praying for at least 75 more students to jump in because we hope that God writes a story like that in the lives of students and families. In fact, I'll tell you how that whole story played out in her family here in just a little bit. But God writes the best stories. Did you catch it with Liz? This is a good story, right? Let me tell you a lousy story. You ready? I got on a bus. I thought I was going to meet cute boys. This just got weird, didn't it? But then my friend didn't show up, so I didn't go. It's a lousy story. Instead, she stayed in the circumstance that she was, and her story is God rescued me. I caught a vision of what my life might look like with God. I started to live his way and obey what he had to say, and now I live in confidence of what God is up to in my life. That's a pretty solid story, wouldn't you say? In fact, it's the exact story that Moses says, I hope you can tell. Check it out in verse 21, chapter 6, verse 21. He says, then you must tell them, this is what he says when your children ask, this is what you must tell them. We were Pharaoh's slaves in Egypt, but the Lord brought us out of Egypt with his strong hand. The Lord did miraculous signs and wonders before our eyes, dealing terrifying blows against Egypt and Pharaoh and all his people. God writes the best stories, and they always begin with rescue. The best stories begin with, I was this, and then God brought me here. God rescued me out of this. For Egypt, it was, we were a people of slavery. It's all we knew. 400 years, like twice as long as our country has existed, they were in slavery. It's all they knew. But God rescued them, and he brought them out of that. We were this, but now we're this. And that's the story of all of us who follow Jesus. We were living our own way, doing the best that we could, but we got to know ourselves well enough that when we tried to do things our way, and we tried to control, and we tried to do the thing, it just always seemed to go wrong. But we realized there was nothing we could do to fix ourselves, but God loved us so much that he sent Jesus to show us a way to live perfectly, to accept all of our brokenness, pay for it in full so that we could be brought out of slavery, so that we could be brought into a life with God. The best stories begin with rescue. And then they continue because it's not just rescue, it's also vision. Check it out in verse 23. He says, he brought us out of Egypt so that he could give us this land he had sworn to our ancestors. You see, God doesn't just rescue out of, he rescues into. God had a vision for his people that they never could have grasped for themselves. They never could have believed what God was going to call them into. He kept trying to paint a picture. I'll lead you into the promised land. It's the land flowing milk and honey. All these things that you didn't build, but I'm going to give you. He had a vision for them, and so he rescued them out so that he could bring them into something totally better. In fact, only, I think, 10 spies, I always forget if it's 10 or 12 spies go into the land, and everybody's terrified except for 2 of them. These are the only people who had any idea what the land looked like. But they said, well, God rescued us. He must have something good in mind for us. We'll trust his vision, which is exactly what we've been calling all of us to do for the last 5 or 6 weeks. God has an amazing vision for your family. God has a greater vision for your family than you could ever have for yourselves. No one wants better. No one wants more for your family than God does. And he proved it when he rescued you. The question is, will your story, when someone says, how did we get this way? Will your story begin with, God rescued us and he had a vision for us? It doesn't stop there. Moses goes on and says this. In verse 24, and the Lord our God commanded us to obey all these decrees and to fear him so that he can continue to bless us and preserve our lives as he has done to this day. Not only did God see fit to rescue and to cast a vision for their lives, but there was a response that was needed. There was a response that the people had to embrace, and that response was obedience and a healthy fear of God. And those were not there so that God can keep them under control, but so that he could bless them and continue to preserve them. Now, before we get too far off, especially those of you who may be not around church that much, you're like, see, told you, it's all about rules. No. Catch this. What came first, rescue or rules? Rescue came first. And so in this rescue over here and this vision that God has for our lives, he loves us and wants what's best for us. Obedience is our trust that says, I believe your rescue mattered. I believe your vision is good. I'll go your way. We obey because it's the way God points us forward to what he has for us. It is the response when you truly trust someone asking you to do something. In fact, isn't that why we get frustrated with our kids when they don't obey? We tell them to do something and we just wish they would trust how much we love them, how much we've already done for them. It's the same with God. He says fear as well. Now, fear, this is not like afraid. There are people who are afraid of God, and people who are guilty should be afraid of a judge. But because of Jesus, we are not guilty, so we have no fear. So what is this fear talking about? This fear is a respect and awe of a power that is far greater than us. You see, God is not a great big man. He's not like the best version of a person that you can imagine. There is no one like him. He has no beginning. He will have no end. There is no limit to who he is. And so fear is the appropriate response. The closest picture I can give you is the ocean. I love this. Someone once painted this picture of the ocean. We're drawn to the ocean, aren't we? Especially those of us living with all beach and no water, right? We're drawn to the ocean. And we look at it and we just stare because we can't even comprehend how far it goes. It's just so much bigger than we can even wrap our hands around. And then when we get into the ocean, we pay attention to the flags a little bit and we pay attention to the waves because there's a healthy fear of how strong that water is, yeah? That's the kind of fear that we're called into because God is capable of sending plagues and bringing rescue. God is capable of raising from the dead. He has an amazing vision for us, and so we obey our way into that vision, and we fear because He is strong. But that's not all. That's our response, obedience and fear. But there's a way in which we do that. It's not a timid way, it's a confident way. Rescue, vision, obedience, and confidence. Check this out in verse 25. For we will be counted as righteous when we obey all the commands the Lord has given us. In this response that Moses is saying, tell your children this when they ask you, how did we get this way? He says, we will be counted as righteous. Now, righteous is kind of a churchy word, and it's a great word. It's a deep word, but it's not one we use very much. Righteous is this idea of being right before a judge. It's simple. That we have nothing to fear because we have been made right. There's two ways to come before a judge. Guilty and innocent. The innocent person is righteous because they have done no wrong. And so they can come before a judge without fear. Whereas a person who is guilty should have fear coming before a judge. It's the same response we have when we're driving down the highway. Right? At whatever speed you happen to be driving at the moment, and you see the car along the side of the road with the stripes and the lights on top, right? Two different responses, one righteous, one not. There is, I'm going 75, it's like, oh, hello, officer, a 10 and 2, my phone is on the ground, I'm good to go, hello, how's it going? Just driving along safely, responsible citizen, right? But there's fear there. On the outside, we polish it up, but quickly there's just terror because it's like, I don't need that ticket right now. Whereas the person who's going at or under the limit can drive by with peace and confidence because they are right. They have nothing to fear. In fact, they're grateful for the person sitting in that car doing a very difficult job to protect our city from the people who drive like 30 miles an hour over and have never heard of this foreign concept called a turn signal. Right? Righteous is we are right. And because of Jesus, Romans 8 is one of the best places to see this. In Romans 8, verses 1 through 4, we have been made right. Not because we have done right, but because Jesus has paid for everything. So it is as if we have obeyed the whole law. So we can be confident before God that even if we mess up at obeying sometimes or lose sight of God's vision, that there is forgiveness, that God's mercies are new every single day, and we can continue to say, God, I got off track, let's get back on track, let's go after that vision you have for us. And we can live in confidence, not only in this life, but in the next, that God will finish what He started, Philippians says. And so here's what we're going to do. I want to challenge all of us to live in such a way that points us toward a story like that. That we would not, when that question is asked, be afraid to answer, but instead would be eager because we have a story of rescue, of vision, of obedience, and of confidence that we can step into that well. And the truth is this, that the choices we make now shape the story that we will tell later. The choices we make now shape the story we will tell later. Now, I know that we can't choose all of our circumstances, but we can choose our direction. And so that's what I'd encourage all of us to do. To wrap up these 6 weeks that we've been talking about, what if we finished by writing a vision for our family? What if we decided as a family, we take all these things that God has been saying and what's been going on in the scriptures and in your lives recently and in your relationship with God and say, God, let's sit down as a family and let's figure out where are we headed. And let's go after that. We've been rescued. Let's embrace God's vision. What is that vision? That way we can obey our way toward it and walk confidently so that when we face that question, we have a response that we can be excited about, that we can be proud of. In fact, I'm convinced that too many times in Christianity, we have spent so much time saying don't, and then do, but the do's are all just practices that are opposites of the don'ts. When instead, I think what the scriptures say is point yourself toward Jesus. Fix your eyes on him, have a vision of where you're headed. And when you do that, all these things that people keep saying don't even make sense. So like the simplest example ever, like don't get drunk, right? Christians say that. Don't get drunk, don't get drunk, don't get drunk. Scripture says that. We shouldn't. But why? Because we are invited to be partners with God to redeem all of creation. So it makes sense in 1 Peter when it says, be clear-minded and self-controlled so that you can pray. Our lives are too valuable and important to lose our mind even for a few hours and miss out on what God is up to. And when we're pointed in a life in that direction, drunkenness doesn't even make sense. When the word says speak as if speaking the very words of God, there are words and language that we should not use. It just doesn't sound like God. Why would we speak that way? We want to speak like him. You see what I'm saying? In the same way, our families, if they were pointed toward a vision that God has for our family, all kinds of sidetracks that we've been on wouldn't even make sense anymore. It wouldn't be easy. I'm not saying that. It's simple, it's not easy. Point yourself in this way, don't veer off. The beauty is Jesus died for when we veer off, and he'll call us back in line. He's faithful to lead us from where we are. So here's what I'd encourage all of us to do. Write a family vision. And here's how I'd encourage you to do it. Write it together. Don't say it, don't think about it, don't just dream about it, write it. Put pen to paper, or if you're like my family, crayon to wall, and write it down. There's something that becomes a reality when you write it. It's more real. You don't have to craft this perfect mission statement that goes on a website somewhere that nobody ever looks at. Throw out adjectives. 5 years from now, what do we want our family to be? We want to be fun. We want to be generous. We want to love people well. We want to be close. Whatever those are, just write down, make a long list of every word everybody in your family can think about. Sit down and just put it all on paper. Put like Christmas paper, flip it over, put it on your table, and just write all over it. And if you want to craft it, great. Or just put the paper on the wall. But write it so that it becomes real. And then 2, post it publicly. Because just like Moses said, we tend to forget. But when we have to walk past it every day, it helps us remember. Or when someone starts living out a line, everybody in the family just goes, right? There is a formal campaign in our home right now on behalf of my 8-year-old for video games and a few other things to be a real part of his life. But as we look at our family vision, which is Team More, we are shaped by God and sent to heal. At this point, we just don't think those come in line for him. It's not a healthy thing for him. It does not get us where we are headed as a family. It's a lens through which we can look at it. It's the same lens that led us to Las Vegas. When a dude named Mitch calls me up and says, hey, Drew, you want to live in Vegas? No. But then he started to describe what God was up to. See, my wife and I had come up with this little statement that we care a lot about a few, 6, 8, 10 months before that. And as he started to describe what God was up to, and as we came out and saw this awesome city that we live in and what God was up to here, we just said, well, we're either shaped by God and sent to heal or not. It seemed like he had shaped a bunch of stuff in us that might help this group of people forward, that we could all go forward together. And it seemed like he was sending us to heal. So I was like, let's do it. Let's go. It gives us a direction to go. Write it together, post it publicly, and revisit it often. God has so much work to do in all of our lives. None of us have arrived. We're still broken, jacked up in different ways, but God is so faithful. He, little bit at a time, makes us more and more like Jesus. The Spirit brings things to mind. The Scripture is spoken in. We obey, and he starts to form us. And that statement or this vision you have of your family will evolve over time. You'll enter new seasons. Children will leave the house, or children will come into the house, or you'll go from being single, and you should write a vision for yourself and your family, and then you'll get married, and you'll need to figure out what that vision looks like, but revisit it often. I wanted to try to give some help on how to do this, and I thought maybe one of the ways we could do this is just kind of going back through the last 5 weeks very quickly. But we're going to do this by way of story, and I'm going to give you at least one question that your family vision should address from each of the last 5 weeks by way of a story, and I want to tell you the story of Dave and Paula. We have a picture of Dave and Paula. They're actually the parents of Liz, the girl in the video earlier. I'm not sure who has greater hair in that picture. It looks like they just walked off the set of Grease. I'm pretty sure they were the bad people. So here's their story. At this point in their life, they were married, and so Dave had grown up in a house that was Catholic, kind of. They went a couple times a year. It was just what they did. If God was in their life, that's what it looked like. Paula had grown up in a house that really didn't attend church. God really wasn't a part of it. Her grandma had followed Jesus and prayed constantly for her granddaughter, but Paula didn't really follow Jesus. When she was 14 years old, a friend invited her to come to church with her. So Paula wore what she always wore, and it was not what the people in the church wore. And she felt completely out of place and sat in the back row and felt very uncomfortable. And then, in case it was unclear, the pastor came to her after the church service and made it clear in no uncertain terms that she did not fit there. Yeah, we need to be careful with our 14-year-olds because you don't have to go tell them that. Your look can tell them that. We need to be careful about the people who walk in. We believe, come as you are. But she believed what he said. I don't fit here. So she just went and lived the way that she had lived. She had a vision she had adopted from her family and generations before, and this is what it looked like. And so she and Dave met. They met at parties because that's what teenagers do. They party on the weekends. In her mind, she could imagine no other vision for her life. She had never encountered a rescue. This is the best vision she could come up with. So they just partied like crazy. They ended up staying together. They ended up getting married. They had a couple of kids, and as they did that, they thought, you know what? I think we want something different for our children. And she thought about her grandma, and Dave thought about his family and thought, you know what, maybe God has a different vision for our family. So they went to the Catholic Church for a little while and tried to figure that out. But they were wrestling with this question for their family, and your mission statement, your vision statement needs to address this first question. It's this: how does this help us embrace God's vision of family and rely on His strength? How does this vision statement that you're going to write help you embrace God's vision of family? That's what Dave and Paula were trying to figure out. They weren't really figuring it out very well, and their kids were becoming teenagers. And in the teenage years, the bad choices that teenagers make, or that children make, the consequences escalate quickly. And Paula, who up to this point, she would say her whole life had been about control. She was afraid of how things would turn out. Super high capacity, super high functioning, started her own business, did all kinds of great stuff, and she tried to control everything, but she was getting tired. And Dave had grown up in a family and had all kinds of circumstance around him that was just really difficult. And so his whole life before Jesus was ticked off. If there was two words that characterized him, that was it. He was just angry all the time. But they were trying to figure out how to make this family thing work and figure out how God would be a part of that. And it was about that time that Liz sat down on a bus to go to camp. And Liz comes home from camp after the week that you heard about and says, Mom, will you go to church with me? She had no idea that for the last 2 weeks, her mom had come to the point of exhaustion. She's like, I got to surrender this somehow to somebody. Somebody way stronger than me has got to put this together because it's falling apart. And so this mother comes to church at a church just like this, about this size, same place, same idea. And they walk into church, and in the first 2 minutes of the service, boom, surrender shows up on the screen. And Paula's like, this is it. This is where I am. She continued to come back alongside this daughter who was being rescued, and they were catching a new vision of family, but husband Dave wasn't figuring it out yet. And guys, we got to go first. And so they were frustrated because there was a son in the family who was watching dad, and dad wasn't really on board yet. But they prayed, and instead of what Paula had done in the past, which was nag and try to control and try to work her way in to figure stuff out, those are her words, not mine. I would never say that. She gave me permission. She didn't give me permission for the picture. I might hear about that later. Instead, she decided to embrace God's vision for family, and she lived out 1 Peter. And she lived a quiet, example life, praying for, encouraging, and respecting her husband, and praying that God would do something awesome in him. And so finally, he decides to come to church with her. Now, he had grown up in a Catholic family. So this whole idea of embracing God's vision for family was a little bit difficult for him, and it had a very particular look and feel, a very Catholic look and feel for him. So he walked into a church like this, and the lights come down, and his whole body just like tenses up. And he's a big dude, he's a football guy, he's just like all tense. She said, I touched his back, and it was like a rock. He was just like, here, and then all of a sudden the music started, and he's looking around, and there's people like trying to get a signal or something. He doesn't know what's happening in the room, and it was just crazy. So he's totally thrown off. But then he sits down, and the preacher comes out, and he starts talking about God and family, and he starts calling men to take the lead in their families. And Dave, this finally figures out this angry, ticked off man whose family was not going the way it should, broke down. And he's like, maybe this is it. Didn't happen in a day, but slowly they started to ask this question, which is the second question your family vision needs to address. How will we ensure that God is our family's main thing? You see, God became a thing in their family, but he wasn't their family's main thing. That took a little more time. It was only a couple of months later when Dave realized, I got to take some lead on this. I got to make sure that I'm also setting a pace for our family. I can't leave that all to my wife. And so he comes down to breakfast, and he's a man of very few words, football coach kind of guy. He comes down and he says, Paula, we're going to do Bible study every morning. Meet me out on the porch. That was it. That was it. Every day for the last 9 years, they've done that. They made God the main thing. And Liz never missed camp after that. She jumped into small groups, had great leaders, had people around her, and God was becoming the main thing in her life. And this son who didn't believe in Jesus, over time they prayed and led and watched because they had led him in a totally different direction for a really long time. But now God was going to be the main thing, and they wanted to be the main thing in his life as well. And you got to wrestle with that. The best families, family the way it was intended to be, God is the main thing, and we need to address that. As they grew up in their faith, they realized, wait, God is like inviting us to change the world with him. They came on a mission trip with us, the whole family, and then they came home and realized, you know what? We don't have to wait once a year to do this. There's a rescue mission right in town. So they started grabbing up teenagers, and they became these leaders, not only of the teenagers, but to lead them to serve in this local rescue mission. They started to answer this third question, which is a must, has to be a part of any godly family vision. It's this. What thing in the world that's not ideal is God sending our family to heal as he heals us? You see, the world is broken, and he is using his people, his church, to bring health and healing to the world. And your family has a unique wiring and a unique ability and a unique place where God can bring healing. For Lane and I, it's been teenagers for a really, really long time. And that's just the way it works for us. I don't know how it works for you, but you got to figure that out. For them, they still do this. They're in Arizona now, and they're investing in teenagers who have been in foster homes their whole lives. They just know what to do. Your family needs a mission. I know your family isn't perfect yet. Neither are the Mitchells. They're being put back together all the time. But as God puts us together, he calls us to help put others back together. Your family vision needs that. Question 4 they wrestled with as well. How will we work toward God's vision for marriages in our family? See, Paula had tried to control, and Dave had been ticked. And what that led to was a wife who disrespected her husband and a husband who didn't do a very good job loving his wife. But as Jesus started to change each of them, they started to figure that out. Starts to rescue Dave from anger. Starts to call Paula into being patient and partnering instead of trying to be out front all the time. And their marriage is thriving. They're 28 years in now. In fact, here's a picture of some other marriages that they're working on. In the top left is Josh, who follows Jesus now because they made Jesus the main thing, even though he didn't find Jesus till college, and his wife, and that marriage is built on Jesus. In the upper right is Liz, the girl from the video earlier, and her fiance, Rory, who will be married in our chapel here on New Year's Eve. And Dave and Paula down there, who are thriving in marriage and loving Jesus like crazy. You see, God writes the best stories. He brought rescue in that family. He gave them a vision that they never had imagined. 10 years ago, 2005, if I walked into the Mitchell household and described today, they never could have imagined it. But God had a vision, and they obeyed and lived their way into that. And now they walk in radical confidence because of what God is doing. They're a family who fights for each other, not against each other. What if right now you decided and developed a vision and said, we are going to live this direction? I don't know what the circumstance is going to be. I don't know what's going to come at you or decisions you'll make that make a mess. But what direction are you going to point so that when, not if, you are asked, how did our family get this way? You can say, because God rescued us and he gave us a vision. And we did our best to obey and woke up and counted on his new mercies every day. And walked in confidence knowing that he will finish what he started. I dread the day when a family would have to say to their kid, woulda, coulda, shoulda. They would stand and say, if I would have done what I should have done, it could have been better. But instead, they lived into the vision that God had for them. Great families are no accident. You have to choose. I know that you don't make a choice on a dime, especially a choice that big, and so here's what we're going to do. We're going to finish our series with a conversation with God, and Jordan's going to sing a song about all this. You can pay attention to the song or not. Jordan's great, but you should instead, sorry, bro. You're great. But what I would encourage you is take this opportunity to have a conversation with God. An honest conversation. If you haven't embraced rescue, open yourself to God rescuing you. If you have, ask God, what is the vision that you have for our family? Set that right alongside the scriptures we've been looking at. Help him allow him, give God space to give you a vision for your family. It's so much better than you can imagine for yourself. And then obey. Commit. Fill in the last blank and say, by this date, our family vision is going to be hanging on the wall. Because when that question is asked, when my children or anybody around me asks, how did our family get this way? Because God rescued, and he gave us a vision, and we did our best to obey, and we live in confidence. Have a great conversation with God as Jordan sings.